All right, well, welcome everyone to this session, New Applicant Fraud Tactics, Safety in the Age of AI. My name is Dustin, and I'm with the Yardi Breeze team, and I'm joined by Seth Winnick from Snap. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, glad to be here.
So, for those of you not familiar, Snap is a leading provider of fraud detection and income verification technology, and Yardi is a leading provider of property management software. Between our two companies, we work with thousands of operators processing millions of applications. And while we're not going to be doing a product demo today, we're actually going to share what both of our teams are seeing out in the market with the rise of AI, new types of fraud, and an alarmingly increasing rate of fraud. We're talking to a lot of operators who are rethinking their leasing workflows and leaning into technology to help detect and ultimately prevent applicant fraud. So, Seth, ready to kick things off here?
Yep, let's do it.
Yeah. Going into this session, we're going to be talking about the latest fraud trends that we're seeing. We'll look at some stats and some specific techniques applicants are using to commit this fraud. And then the second half of the session, we're going to be talking about actionable tools and strategies you can use to prevent fraud by looking at some of the key touch points during the leasing workflow. But Seth, your team doing a lot of fraud detection. What's your team seeing out there?
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. Overall, just with rents increasing and inventory constricting, markets are becoming extremely competitive, and renters are essentially doing whatever they can to get into a home. It's just not as easy as it once was. But fraudsters are capitalizing on this by continuously coming up with new ways to game the system. And furthermore, now they're incorporating AI into their practices, making it even more difficult to catch the fraud that they're introducing into the market. Fraud can take a few different forms, from an individual leveraging their own tool, which we'll dive into later, or leveraging third-party tools known as fraud as a service, which helps them ultimately get approved and get into the apartment without your property managers recognizing that the applicant isn't legit and the information they provided isn't legit. So, in short, long term, long gone are the days where you can use an in-person interaction and the eye test to combat fraud.
Yeah. That's what we're seeing. That's what a lot of our clients are seeing too. And I bet for the audience here, this probably isn't a new concept. I'm sure you all have seen, rental application fraud in prior years. So one, this is an issue we've seen in the past, but this is something in the last few years. Organizations like NAA, NMHC, Snap, Yardi, we're seeing a big increase. And when surveying property managers, over 93% of property managers experienced rental application fraud at their properties last year. And even with that stat, the 7% who didn't experience fraud, I'm kind of wondering, like, did did they have a lucky year? Do they have a unique portfolio? Or is there a chance that, you know, that 7% might be letting some applicant fraud go undetected as well? And we might kind of understand that better when we look into some of the fraud rates across the US here in a bit. But for those who did experience fraud, 70% saw an increase in fraud compared to the year prior. So the sentiment is that fraud is on the rise. Also, when operators are looking at you doing a retrospective on their evictions, around 23% of those evicted residents, when looking back at their initial application, had some fraudulent information on that initial application. So definitely seeing that correlation from those fraudulent applicants who get approved have a higher chance to become evicted. And then the last stat I'll share, smaller operators managing 1,000 units and less are 10% more likely to experience rental application fraud compared to large operators. And Seth, we were talking about this earlier, like the hypothesis is that, larger operators are more likely to already have some of this fraud detection technology in place today, right? And they have those systems in place. And then those applicants who are committing fraud, they're going to look at management companies with lower guardrails, less technology in place that they can, exploit certain systems.
That's absolutely right. I mean, we'll dive into some knowledge sharing tactics, but overall, fraudulent activity is not limited to one portfolio type. It's actually widespread. And we'll dive into the specifics here in a bit.
Yeah. So the question is, what's causing an increase in fraud and ultimately an increase in bad debt? I think there's a few factors at play. One is the macro factors, the economy. We're seeing, layoffs in different industries, increasing rents. And I think it's putting pressure on maybe some otherwise honest people who are not career criminals, but they're making ends meet and they're justifying committing fraud because in their mind they might have true intentions of being a good resident, making on-time rent payments. And while some of them do, we know a lot of them do not, and they're not truly qualified for that apartment or for that community. But all in all, I would say there's definitely some economic macro factors that are causing this increase, but also what Seth will talk about in a moment here, new types of fraud, right? So before it used to just be photoshopping a pay stub would be maybe the most common one. But now with AI and just how easy it is to manipulate identities and documents. There's just new ways to manipulate documents, but also some crime rings that are helping others commit fraud, which is pretty alarming. So we'll talk about some new types here in a moment. But then all in all, the new types spiked up very fast, but the systems to detect this have been lagging a little bit behind across the industry. And maybe some companies have partial systems in place, is what we're seeing, like a good resident screening system or a way to link bank accounts to verify income. But if you leave certain gaps within your leasing workflow, that's where fraudsters are going to go and exploit any possible gaps. So I think those combo of these three is kind of creating the perfect storm to see this increase in fraud.
Yeah, and I'm gonna lead this slide with just saying one of my favorite or least favorite, depending on how you view it, quotes in the industry, which is "We don't have a fraud problem." It's not uncommon to hear a property manager or property management company say that they actually don't experience fraud at their portfolio. But the truth is that fraud's not fully recognized until you notice the number of evictions at the end of the year and the financial impact that it has on your books. So to put this in a perspective, the average eviction that we have found in the industry is about $7,500 per eviction. And Dustin, as you mentioned, we found that 24%, roughly 24% of evictions are tied to fraudulent activity. So when you think about pairing the two together, it's like if you implement, a fraud mitigation solution in your screening workflow, you could potentially decrease your evictions by, up to 24% if you're able to catch all the fraud. And that's a significant number, right? So overall, fraud problems do exist. It results in real money when you don't catch it and it hits your books and it impacts your business.
Yeah. And definitely an alarming stat there. Seth, your team has a lot of data as far as when you're helping your clients catch and prevent fraud here. And you've got some of the, what is this, top 10, cities, metros with highest fraud rates.
Yeah, and what I want to start this slide with is that the fraud hotspots, they change year over year. It's an evolving landscape along with the evolving rental landscape. So it's not limited to an isolated region, and fraud essentially has, as you see here, a national footprint. The unfortunate truth is that fraudsters shift their targets based on market trends, communicating with each other, and overall vulnerabilities that surface over time. The average fraud rate in the nation is 5.1%. And when you look into some different cities across the nation, here it's California, Texas, Indiana, Florida. Some of these fraud rates can actually get closer to about 9%. And if I was to guess, this list will look a little different next year. The fraud may remain the same, right? But the areas that are impacted could shift. So it's important to ensure that you are, analyzing your screening process and preparing for a potential fraud wave, even if you're not experiencing that today, because it could be an issue for portfolios in some areas that aren't highlighted tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's certainly alarming. I feel like the perception, a few years ago was like maybe this is just like a regional problem, like in the Sun Belt where there's new developments popping up. But, clearly it really looks like the data is proving this is an increasing problem across the nation here. Um, so now we've talked about, the US data and that fraud is on the rise. Seth, I'm kind of curious to hear how specifically applicants are committing rental fraud.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sort of working our way from most basic to most organized. Dustin, you called this out earlier, but the most basic form of fraudulent activity when it comes to verifying someone's income or employment is modifying the PDF. This is still the most widely used fraud ta tactic out there. Just overall modifying documents in general, but PDF editing specifically. This can be done with a basic PDF editing software. It's hard to catch just by looking at the document because the information's been updated. It's not as advanced as other solutions that we'll dive into here shortly, but it still highlights, just how much of an impact manual editing can have just on the manual review process at the time of screening. But as we move up to template farming, this is actually the number one fraud method we saw last year. So it still includes documents, but it's a little more sophisticated in that if I'm an applicant, I can go online, I can find a template, download the template or pay for it, and actually enter in the information myself. And when I go to apply for an apartment and I provide these documents, again, the eye test isn't going to catch this. It looks like a legitimate pay stub, but really this is just a plug and play sort of model where I don't even need to rely on an existing PDF. It's more of just a template that I downloaded. Tier three here, it gets even more complex, which advanced fraud rings have really capitalized on, as I mentioned, market trends and they share information with one another, but they also distribute their fraudulent tools across the nation and they target areas to see how successful they can be and they communicate with each other to try to figure out how can they game the system, where should they game the system, and basically it becomes this one-off, hey, I'm going to modify this template or modify my PDF documents to, oh, I can be advised exactly where I should apply because I'm more likely to get into this apartment based off of the knowledge that's being shared amongst fraud rings. And lastly, here we have inception fraud, which is the most complex. This is where an organization sets up a legitimate LLC and they, for instance, get an ADP account, set up the ADP account, and they work with people who are trying to get into apartments they issue them actual pay stubs that look legitimate and are quote unquote legitimate, but the business itself isn't an actual business. It's set up to provide these statements. So basically fraudsters can get into apartments. So you can see it really is a wide span here from basic to very complex fraudulent strategies.
Yeah, that's alarming. I think a lot of us are familiar with these first two tiers of editing documents or getting someone else to do that, but these next two, interested to hear a bit more about those, Seth, as we get into the session, because those are kind of some new ideas or things I think people might be unaware of. Um, and talking about you talked about levels of fraud. I would say also just like types of fraud and how specific their fraudsters are doing it. There are different types where you're talking about first party fraud versus third party fraud. And I would say first party would be, I, Dustin Daly, am applying as Dustin Daly, but I'm going to submit a fake pay stub that's edited, right? But I'm using my own identity. Third party fraud would be, I, Dustin Daly, I'm applying as Seth Winnick, right? Maybe you have a better, credit score, or maybe I'm using my brother's identity because he has a better credit criminal. So it could be a stolen identity, could be a borrowed identity, or I could be applying as Jesse Johnson, who doesn't exist at all, right? But I'm using Seth's social, I'm using my employment information and kind of creating a synthetic identity. So different types, but I would say identity theft is one that we see very early on to the application process, and yeah, stolen identities can definitely qualify as rental application fraud.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, I mean, synthetic identity has been around for a long time, and just with the advancement of technology, it's compelling to see how it's evolved and how much easier it is to create a fake ID now. But sort of shifting our focus back to what I was talking about before with document fraud specifically, I'm going to fly through some examples here, but. The first example is text insertion. That's where if I download a PDF document, I can go in, use a PDF editing software and update my income or name or whatever text I want to modify. I can easily go in and basically change any information on that document. When it comes to online templates, spoke on this before, but it's going online to a fraudster site, downloading well-known templates that I can just go in and enter the information that I see fit, from employer to name to income amount, whatever it is. It's all falsified data with templates that have been proven to work for systems that don't have fraud mitigation tools in place. Done for you documents get a little bit more complex where I'm not entering the information myself. I can go online and order an actual completed document. So I don't, all I need to do is give them the information that I want in the finalized document, and they can actually create a document that has some of the metadata in it, so it's harder to catch and not easier to spot. So you're kind of moving from the eye test specifically to actually being able to capture some of the document details itself when if you were going to analyze it further.
That looks like who is this? Mrs. Get Approved? It looks like she's openly marketing on Instagram or Facebook or something, right? This isn't just like on the dark web. This is pretty blatant.
Yeah, absolutely. This is not a very subtle approach to to get a falsified document. That the business is pretty straightforward in what they do, but yeah, there these types of companies are out there.
Interesting.
So we've talked about AI a lot, but as you can imagine, there are solutions out there where you can actually prompt AI to generate a Mrs. Done for you doc yourself. If I want to log in, I can order a document, feed the information into a tool, and it spits out a finalized document that I can use for an application. So it's getting pretty scary on how AI is leveraged in this space. Social engineering is really where organized crime rings, they will communicate with each other, giving tips. You can go online and see even on in places like Reddit or Facebook, there are people sharing knowledge on how to get into apartments using fraudulent services. And then inception fraud. Again, this is really just tied to an applicant's stated employer. The document itself isn't the problem. It's the business that it ends up being the problem, because if you were going to analyze the document, everything looks legit. But the business, when you look into what type of business it is, you can find fraud trends, and that's even harder to catch in today's market.
This one is wild. This is going to such a great length to get approved, right? Creating a shell company is unbelievable.
Absolutely. And there are when you look at the services that are spun up to combat fraud, it really is like how do you dive into the business specifics? How do you get super granular and super in the weeds to identify where the fraud lives? It's not just the document. It goes way deeper than that now. And technology has evolved to catch this type of fraud.
Very interesting. The last type of fraud that we're seeing on the Yardi side, CPN fraud. That's credit privacy number. You see this marketed online, and sometimes this is marketed in a way to folks to repair or boost up their credit score. But in reality, what a CPN number is, it's an illegal and essentially a fake social security number that folks are using to apply for apartments. And these can be pretty hard to detect if you don't have a service or platform that's validating these socials against an official database. The Yardi team is seeing such high volume of this that every 3 minutes, someone out there is applying for a unit with a synthetic identity or one of these using a CPN number. So this is just kind of everywhere right now, and it's causing a lot of operators to really rethink some of their screening workflows. So now that Seth and I have scared you about a lot of different types of fraud that you may or may not have been aware of, we want to talk about some of the key touch points in the leasing workflow to where you might think about inserting some fraud detection tools. And in order to really make this a success and make fraud prevention your superpower, the tip we can share is to really layer in some of these resident screening and fraud detection tools throughout your leasing workflow instead of jamming them all at the front or all at the end of the leasing flow. And we're going to kind of cover some of these items here on the right: verifying IDs, resident screening, document and income verification. And these are all great tools that have been proven to help detect and prevent fraud. And sometimes when we're working with operators, the objection might be, well, hey, all these tools are great and they can help prevent or detect fraud, but I don't want to cause friction in the leasing workflow. Seth mentioned the fraud rate's 5% nationally. I don't want to cause friction for the 95% of applicants who have nothing to hide, and we want a good experience for them, right? So I think there is definitely a valid concern to balance friction and also having good systems in place. Seth, do you hear that from companies you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, friction is definitely a factor when considering whether or not you want to introduce a new fraud mitigation tool. But what I always go back to our customers with or our partners with is you want a little bit of friction, right? I think when it comes to fraud, you want to scare the fraudsters a little bit. And you also want to instill confidence in the applicants knowing that you have a secure solution. You don't want to make it super involved and very hard for an applicant to get approved, but at the same time, when you do implement some processes that introduce a little bit of friction, it ends up deterring some of the fraudsters and making them think twice about proceeding with the application if they know that you have somebody or some tool in place that will essentially catch whatever they're trying to do to circumvent the application process.
No, that's a good point. And I would say, working with a lot of companies who are adopting these tools for the first time, some questions you might want to ask if you're researching, different solutions after this is like, does your solution integrate natively into your property management software, into your application portal? Um, and is it a good experience for the applicant? Can you go and demo and see what it looks like for them, right? Do they have to create multiple accounts to verify information? Or does your team on site have to, do double data entry, or is it all native into one workflow? And can you insert these where you want in your leasing workflow and not having to change your workflow around the technology? So I would recommend vetting this and making sure it's a good experience on both sides. But like Seth says, get some advantages of having kind of a blue sign effect to show you have solid systems in place to deter fraudsters up front.
Hmm.
So going into the first step is even before the application is submitted. It's that when an initial lead comes in and you're about to schedule a showing, whether it's a text, an email, an in-person. What a lot of operators are doing is using an ID verification tool to prove that person is who they say they are from the start, right? And this is Seth going to your point, that blue sign effect to say, hey, we've got good systems in place. Because hey, maybe Dustin Daly, I was going to apply as myself, but I was going to edit some documents later on. But I can see, wow, this management company has good systems. I'm just going to go down the street to a company that's doing things, pen and paper.
And
So
just to piggyback off of that a little bit, I mean, it's not uncommon for, somebody to sign up for a tour, but it's actually Seth's brother that shows up. And Seth's brother is the one going through the tour, and you want to make sure that they are who they say they are from the get-go, because otherwise you're wasting time on a fraudulent applicant when you could be dedicating that time towards a legitimate prospective tenant. And it's just, it's every stage of the cycle is important to closely monitor to ensure that you're maximizing the value for your staff.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of visualize, if I bet a lot of us have actually used this ID verification tool, maybe in like for a banking institution in the past. But really, how this works is, you take a selfie and then you take a front and back image of your ID, and it does a quick biometric comparison, and it just verifies that that person is. There's not like this big form to fill out or anything. It's actually a pretty quick instant verification that you get to proceed to the application. And when that's submitted, this is where our traditional resident screening comes into play. And I'm sure everyone on this call here has some sort of system in place to get credit in criminal checks. And Yardi's been doing resident screening for many years, and kind of what we learned over the time is like not all screening services are built equal. Seth, I know your background here is in resident screening as well, but some things I've learned here at Yardi is that being able to get instant results for credit and criminal, being able to set up a customizable decision criteria where you can set up, you know, your own risk tolerance and, property criteria you have for applicants, making sure they comply with your local and state regulations. I know where I'm at in California, these screening laws are just ever evolving, and partnering with a service that's staying on top of those for you can definitely have its advantages. And then ultimately, when the screening is run, does it provide an automated recommendation based on your business rules and criteria to provide like a conditional, approval or denial based on your criteria to eliminate some of the human bias or potential errors here? Um, and then different components you can get in with rental history, landlord verification, civil court records, verifying social security to prevent CPN fraud. So different pieces you can include in your package. But again, this is probably one of the tools that operators already have in place today.
And I just want to highlight something you said, which is automating the decision. It's very important for your chosen vendors to be able to take time off of, take that task off of your staff's plate so they can focus on the human element of, leasing up the property or, working with the existing tenants. It's, the benefit of technology is to help with the decisioning component and making you more compliant, but also just giving time back to your staff at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And Seth, when the application is submitted, the resident screening is approved, your team helps a lot with income verification as well. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So income verification is handled a few different ways, income and employment. The t tools that are highlighted here really bank linking, so connecting straight to your bank or payroll databases, so I can connect to ADP, I can connect to my employer. Um, the one thing that I want to call out here is that their fraud does live here as well. This is where inception fraud typically lives. So it can still be inherently a little bit risky to rely exclusively on this, but I can say with certainty that it adds a layer of authenticity to your workflow when you can connect to your payroll provider directly or bank provider, right? I don't want to say it's 100% fraud free because that's where inception fraud lives, but it is an important component to introduce to your workflow so that applicants can just automatically connect to verify their income or employment. And then last here on the list is verification of rent. That's also something that's being automated as well. So reaching out to previous landlords or property managers to actually validate that this applicant did live at the places that they used that they stayed that they lived at. That whole process is being automated as well to again save your staff time, make it more reliable, and it's just really interesting to see all of these pieces become more automated.
Yeah, and kind of curious, Seth, I've kind of heard, do some residents or applicants have some hesitation to provide their banking details or payroll details? Like, do they push back on that?
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important to, if you even want to go to the next slide, I think it's important to sort of diversify the way in which that you're verifying income because you want to have a flavor for every single applicant. I may be comfortable because I'm tech savvy. Yeah, sure. You want me to connect to my ADP payroll provider? Yeah, sure. I can go ahead and do that. Or you want me to connect to Bank of America? Sure, yeah, I'll give my credentials, but not everyone is like that. So that's why it's important to also offer the document verification downstream or wherever you see fit, because there's going to be different strokes for different folks, right? But if you are going to introduce these different workflows, it is super important to make sure that you're introducing the fraud mitigation practices alongside that. So the tools here are AI-enabled fraud detection solutions, checks for any sort of visual modifications, or even looking into the metadata, which is like the data that lives within the document to see has it been modified at all. Um, so every single layer has its own form of fraud. Fraudsters are always looking to, figure out a way to get around the system, but we're staying up with it, right? And staying ahead of the curve in many cases to combat fraud at every step.
That makes sense. I can definitely see why that combo of those two would provide that right layering tools to make sure there's no gaps. If someone opts out of bank linking, you have a way to detect the altered document, is what I'm hearing.
Yep.
Um, So let's say the applicant clears the resident screening, they verify their income, they're approved, and now it's time to sign their lease. Seth, we were talking about this earlier, like when post-COVID, we saw like a sharp change with how, units were with self-showing, with virtual tours, with online applications, a big rise in this. And then with all this new technology, finally, when it comes to signing the lease, we saw a big increase in adoption of e-signature platforms, right? And I would say there's different flavors of this. Some are natively embedded into the applicant portal. And going back to our discussion of like removing friction, not having a separate e-signature platform that the resident has to go in to sign, that could, eat a couple days away of like the back and forth and them creating a separate account. But do you have a secure way where once they're approved to quickly execute that lease and then when they're approved, having that lease uploaded into their resident portal could one just be a very secure way to see this whole process through instead of having someone else come in person and sign for them, right?
Yeah, and I think just in a post-COVID world, like as everything becomes more digital, the expectations are also being set at a rapid pace where now, your customers are or property managers or whoever it is expects everything to live in one place. Whereas maybe 5, 10 years ago, it was okay to log into different systems. Now it's like we're so used to having everything on our phone or everything in one system, and it's important to stay up with the times because they are evolving rapidly.
Yeah. And speaking of that, that digital first experience, we're seeing an increase in things like digital keys or smart lock integrations. And really, once the applicant has been approved and they go in to get maybe a physical key or digital key, you want to do one more quick check, or maybe a lot of operators are opting to do this. That person picking up the keys is that same person that applied and was approved, right? It's not Seth's brother that's actually moving in and Seth is helping him out, or it's not me subletting to someone else, right? It's the ability to create this ID verification, maybe in person. A lot of operators will have an iPad in their leasing office to help them with this, or from their cell phone. Just one more, check to make sure that person is who they say they are before they get all the keys and do that final move in. And then I would say fraud prevention doesn't start, it doesn't end right after move in. I would say there's definitely some ongoing monitoring where, maybe that once that person moves in, do they completely change their resident portal information, different email? Is there irregular payment behaviors? Does the maintenance team see something out of the ordinary? So definitely one, making sure your team is aware of the concept that fraud is on the rise, and then not just your leasing team, but also your property management and maintenance team can keep an eye out for any illegal subletting, is what we can sometimes see post move in here. So wrapping up, key takeaways. Hopefully, you all been able to get from this session. The data is proving that applicant fraud is on the rise, and unfortunately, smaller operators are getting disproportionately targeted if they don't have systems in place today. And AI has made document manipulation a lot easier. But there's a lot of new tools that can help detect and kind of fight AI with AI to detect fraudulent documents, to make income verification a lot easier, to make ID verification a lot easier versus just the eyeball test, right? And the goal is to equip your team so they don't have to be fraud detectives, right? This is, you know, impossible to detect with the naked eye right now. And it's kind of a big emotional burden to accuse someone of committing applicant fraud, right? That's a big decision to make. And instead of that person having to make that decision, lean on the technology and kind of be on the applicant side and say, hey, this was flagged as something's wrong here. Can you re-verify a different way? Maybe link your bank account or submit a different document. And giving your team the ability to spot these red flags and focus on that human element set that you were talking about.
Yeah, and it's also it's not only the technology, but also when you're working with a technology provider, you do typically work with experts in the field. So you do, there are people still behind the technology that help advise and be the experts in mitigating fraud, so your team doesn't have to be.
Absolutely. So, if you want to kind of take some of this back with you and your teams, Seth and I have a couple of resources for you. The first one is a rental fraud prevention self-assessment worksheet. So, going back to those different items in the leasing workflow, maybe you can do a quick self-assessment of, do you have something in place today? And if not, is this an upcoming goal to kind of look into after the session here? And then, Seth, you've got a 2026 multifamily fraud report.
Yep. So we have a multifamily fraud report just highlighting all the fraud trends. Actually, some of these slides were pulled from that report as well. But if you want to double click into any sort of information around, income and document fraud, as well as, connected payroll, whatever, if any of this sparked your interest, definitely, I encourage you to uh, scan the QR code, go to the fraud report and read up a little bit more about it so you can educate your teams and your stakeholders on what's happening in our industry.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good resource and a good lead behind here. Wanted to thank everyone for their time today. Seth, thanks for helping educate the IRO group here for these new fraud trends that we're seeing. If you all have any questions, please reach out. And if you also want to join the conversation, in this comments section here for this IRO summit, if you are, if you've experienced applicant fraud and you've got stories to share, lessons learned, would invite you all to join the conversation. Seth, thanks again so much for joining, and thank you all for your time today.
Yeah, thanks so much.